Okay, today I am talking with Tara Flood, who is an inclusion expert, activist, campaigner. Um, but before we get on to that, Tara, can you tell us a little bit about your Paralympic history?
I can. It feels like a long time ago now, but my first. I'd always been into sport and swimming, particularly from being a very young person. But my first Paralympics, although it wasn't called a Paralympics, was the delightfully titled International Games for the Disabled in 1984 in New York, and then I did 88 in Seoul, and then my last Paralympics was in Barcelona 1992. But in between, like you, Robin, I did lots of different international and national events right across Europe. So I was a very busy Paralympian, disabled swimmer for all of that time and loved every minute of it. It was the best experience of my life. There were lots of things that I would want to have changed about it in terms of how uh, disability sport is organised, and that was one of the reasons that I left in 1992. But I never ever fell out of love with the sport itself.
I very, very similar to yourself, is got utterly disillusioned with the management as it was then, and the complete denial of opportunity for disabled athletes to go into management roles, which is kind of why we're campaigners. I mean, we always were. So just kind of before we leave the Paralympics, obviously the 2020 Paralympics are currently going on. How do you feel that now that they're getting such coverage and kind of the athlete profiles and seeing people in dreams adverts and stuff like that?
So, look, I mean, I've got to, even the most hardened activist has got to accept that there is something really interesting happening in the media in terms of disabled athletes. And I remember, as I'm sure you will have done, that in 92, which was my most successful Paralympics, gold medal, world record, two silvers and a bronze, I couldn't have been more successful from my perspective. And yet I was pretty sure that it was only people that knew me back in the UK who had any idea that I'd been that successful. And that sounds a bitter take on it, because and I wasn't bitter about it, but I recognized that the media had a lot to do to recognize and to treat us fantastically successful athletes with the same level of respect and interest as they did Olympic athletes. And I think if anything has changed, that's changed. So now, very slowly, a very small handful of British Paralympic athletes are now starting to gain some degree of celebrity status, and that's good, I think. Um, but I think there are lots of things that come with that that I think we as disabled people, we as disabled campaigners and activists need to be calling out. I think there is still far too much obsession with wanting to know what our impairments are. So I just listened on the radio um, to an account of yesterday's success, and every single account of a race starts with describing an athlete's impairment. And I really look forward to the time where I don't have to hear that, because what? No one really cares. They really don't care. They're only, and you must have noticed this. The thing that really shifted for me was London 2012. I went along to every swimming final, and also saw other events. And just being in the crowd, it was clear no one cared about the descriptions of someone's physicality. All they were interested in was whether or not a British athlete had won a medal. And the excitement around that was fantastic. And oh God, I remember kind of almost now, kind of like hairs going up on the back of my neck, being part of a kind of like a crowd of people who were just absolutely delighted that one of our own had got a medal, had won a race, whatever it was. And that shifted, hasn't it? But I think so but let's ditch the kind of obsession with people's impairment labels.
Which really leads nicely into kind of talking to you about the other half of you, or the contemporary you, which is as an inclusion expert, and you've done a huge amount of work in education, and still involved in that. But I'd like you to tell the viewers actually a little bit about what you're now doing and kind of how it all ties together.
Yeah, okay. So yeah, that's right. I'm never sure I like to describe myself as an expert, really. I much rather describe myself as an inclusionist or an inclusion activist. But yeah, so I mean, all of that work, I suppose my activism really comes from childhood experience of segregated education. And this idea that we still, even in 2021, think that it's perfectly acceptable to segregate groups of disabled children and adults into separate institutions because somehow we are going to get a better education or we're going to have a better life separated from society. It's just, it's always been nonsense to me, and it continues to be nonsense. And so I will always continue until we see an end to that. I will always campaign for an ending of segregation, whether or not it's the shutting of segregated schools or institutions where many thousands of disabled people still are warehoused. But so I was the director of the Alliance for Inclusive Education for 14 years, and 2 years ago decided to leave, and I'm now working weirdly for a local authority, London Borough of Hammersmith and Fulham, really in a role that was created out of my activism. I job share with my colleague Kevin Caulfield, which I'm sure some people will know, who is also a disability rights activist. And we created a role out of a piece of work that I did before I started working at the council. I chaired a Disabled People's Commission that was pulled together by the visionary leader of the council, Steve Cowan, who's been an amazing ally to disabled people in the borough. And we were all disabled people, and we kind of thought it was probably going to be a once in a generation opportunity. So we decided to focus on something big. So not thinking about the little bits and pieces that you could do to tweak around the edges, but let's go for something big. And what do we know? Well, we know that disabled people, whatever our intersectional barriers, are furthest away from the decision-making process. So what could we do to address that? So we decided to focus on seeking a commitment from the local authority that they would start to co-produce policies and service design and delivery with local disabled residents. And I know, as with inclusion, co-production is a much misunderstood concept, because people will often think that co-production is basically just a new word for engagement or a new word for really crappy consultation. And we've been really clear in our definition of co-production that it's about disabled people and decision makers working together from the beginning to design, deliver, and evaluate policies and services that will remove the barriers that disabled people face. That's a working definition, and it's one that we will change as we start to, I suppose, embed it. But Kevin and I are employed to turn that commitment into reality. And we think we're the first local authority to commit to that across all aspects of a local authority. And I think that probably there is a context in which we sought that commitment, and it's the context of being the only local authority to still not charge disabled people for home care. And we are holding tight to that commitment, even in these really difficult circumstances, because I don't think we've quite reached the tipping point where if Kevin and I weren't there, that commitment would remain. But there is something really important in being within a local authority that sees home care charging as discriminatory. So I guess we're at the local authority, and it's interesting being disability rights activists working for a local authority, because usually we are campaigning against those kind of structures, because those kind of structures often make things much more difficult for disabled people. But we are in at the heart of the beast, I think, to try to show what it's possible to do if you have a local authority who is wanting to understand independent living, wanting to understand its role, the role that it can play in addressing exclusion and inequality as experienced by disabled people.
I think that's incredible. Because as a campaigner myself, we've done so much work just trying to um, stop the erosion of services. To hear such a positive story of engagement and commitment to our participation in the decision making that goes into the services, rather than this is what we've decided, what do you think?
Yeah, exactly.
Just to close, really, what would you say to our viewers on how they can keep their heads up, keep their heads above water, and continue to fight for what they need in their lives?
Oh God, Robin, that's a good question. I think I suppose it's what keeps me going, really, and it's the sense of knowing, being really clear about the change that we want to make, and understanding the role that we play in leading that change, but recognizing that we can't do it on our own. I think one of the most important things is knowing who our allies are. So our allies, and I learned this when I was at the Alliance for Inclusive Education, and I guess it's the same with any civil rights movement, isn't it? That whilst the people who are most affected and will benefit most by the change need to be leading the change, we need to have allies alongside us to really push for that change. So it's building a movement of disabled people, but also seeking allies along the way, because this is not a quick fix. The things that we are wanting to change, the oppression, the inequality, the discrimination that is relentless in our lives, let's be honest, has been created through decades, and the fix for that will take just as long. So this is about knowing the change that we can create, and building a movement. And there is a movement of disabled people, there is a movement of disabled people's organisations. So find your local organisation of disabled people. They exist. They are struggling at the moment for all the reasons that we know, but they do still exist. And London has got some amazing organisations. Newham has got some amazing organisations right across London, and they are across the country too. But it's finding them, recognising that the change that you're calling for, that we are calling for as individuals, are the same changes that the movement has been calling for decades now. So get involved in the movement. If you haven't heard about the social model, find out about the social model, because for disabled people, for me, it was like a light going on in my life, because it helps you understand that it's not our responsibility as disabled people to fit in with society. It is absolutely the responsibility of society to make room for disabled people, and to value our existence, and to value our citizenship. Yeah, and I suppose it's remembering that we're not going to change everything immediately. It's looking for the small changes that you can make that start to build a movement towards the big changes, which is why in Hammersmith and Fulham we focused on ending home care charging, because actually it started to create an environment, a context where we can start to say, actually, if we're not going to charge for home care, what we also need to do is think about the other things that we need to do, that disabled people need to lead around, which is we need to shift away from the language of adult social care, and we need to think about what an independent living service looks like. We need to think about what an inclusive education service looks like. these are all things that disabled people have been talking about for decades, but we need to start to, I suppose, remind people that those campaigns, despite the pandemic, despite austerity, are still the important things that we need to focus on.
Brilliant. So, Tara, thank you so much. Keep up the great work.
Well, listen, thank you too. All right, take care.